Good morning and hello everyone. My name is Pavan Sukhdev and I speak with you today about poverty and biodiversity. These are the two themes of your conference and I believe them to be probably two of the most important concerns of our time. The persistence of poverty despite all efforts to achieve the Millennium Development Goals and the degradation and continuing loss of biodiversity are indeed defining challenges of our times. And these challenges are connected, and frankly it's a story of old debates and new challenges, because the number of times that we've had to struggle with understanding the connection between one and the other, and the amount of effort that has been put to recognize the reality that in fact it isn't just an old-fashioned trade-off between conservation on the one hand and poverty on the other, but in fact the whole complex of connected challenges and issues is not insignificant. Nature, I believe, is a treasury of the poor. And although the traditional prevalence of a trade-off thinking has been there for a long time, the reality is that the poor do depend on the goods and services of nature, and they must, because these are public goods and services, and where they are allowed to, they are received free. If you are poor, naturally you will gravitate towards whatever comes to you for free. Today, more than 3/4 of a billion people who are considered below the poverty line are in fact subsistence farmers. And these subsistence farmers have to depend by the nature of their work on the bounties that come to them from ecosystems, the fertility of their soils, the availability of fresh water and nutrients. These are flows which come to the farming communities and have to be conserved if we are to ensure that the safety net that is provided to these poor is maintained. I must say that very often the word biodiversity itself is a misleader, because when we talk about biodiversity, what we mean, of course, is not just the diversity at an ecosystem, species or genetic level, but also the quantity that's available, and the quantity matters. The extent to which the poor depend upon biodiversity is largely a reflection of the volume of ecosystem services. It is the quantity of the fish in the oceans that matters. It is the flow of fresh water and nutrients that matters, and not just diversity. I would argue that there are probably 4 clear and important ways in which poverty and biodiversity are connected. The first is food, because bushmeat in areas which are forested is a huge provider of protein for the poor, and in countries like Congo it can be as high as 75% of the population that depends upon bushmeat for protein. And fish are the main source of animal protein for more than 1 billion people in the developing world. And these people are, in many cases, dependent in turn upon poor fishing populations along coastlines, which are deeply stressed because of the ongoing loss of quantity of fish in the oceans. Pelagic fisheries and the fact that we have excess capacity of the order of 200 to 280% in commercial fishing fleets is one of the drivers of the losses of quantity of fish in the oceans. But the sufferers from these losses are largely those who depend upon them for their livelihood. Of the 35 odd million fisher folk, almost 30 are subsistence, if you like. They are the so-called artisanal fisher folk who depend upon fisheries. The loss of the ocean stocks is a deep problem for them, not just because of livelihoods, not just because of food, but it is basically their whole existence. In addition to food, of course, we have to look at the livelihoods aspect in seriousness, because agriculture today employs almost half the working population of this world, and many of these are in developing and poor countries. We cannot look at simplistic solutions to agricultural extension or simplistic answers towards agricultural productivity, especially when we know how much the poor depend on yield and on the ability and the sustainability of their output for their livelihoods. A study was done a few years ago by Julius Pretty and others, which demonstrated across 56 developing countries around the world, covering several million farms and almost 300 projects, that the yield on farms, if it were managed in a way which is ecologically friendly, and by that I mean applying techniques as straightforward as low tillage or no tillage agriculture, or using crop rotation, or using species within the same crop so that they are not affected by pests in the same way, or reusing farm water and using farm manure, etc., etc. These are ecologically friendly techniques. They're very simple techniques at one level, but they're very often not the techniques that we advocate when we try and focus poor farms, small farms, on increasing of yields by making use of pesticides and fertilizers in an extension of what is in fact an industrial farming method. The reality is that out of the 525 million farms around the world, 400 million are less than 2 hectares in size, which means basically poor farmers, subsistence farmers. The solutions for them are available, but those solutions are not going to be available in the way that it is often described, which is very much a brute force application of yield enhancing fertilizers and yield defending pesticides. So in addition to livelihoods and looking at the ways in which livelihoods can be made more secure and in which the safety net of nature can be made more permanent, we have to look at ecologically friendly methods, and we have to recognize that these are the ones, if any, which will provide the solutions which are biodiversity positive. Using organic and indeed any form of ecologically friendly farming tends to be softer and less damaging on the nature that surrounds these farms. And therefore there is a consequent reduction in the potential risk and loss of biodiversity. The third connection between the poor and biodiversity is spiritual almost, in the sense that they depend in many cases on nature as their spiritual connector. In India, my country, there are more than 50,000 groves which are considered to be sacred groves. And these are areas of forest which may or may not be within protected areas, but to which the community locally has a deep connection, a spiritual connection. And one has to recognize and respect that. And finally, one has to look at the whole issue of vulnerability and resilience, as we sometimes refer to it. Because as climate changes, it is in fact the poor who are the most likely to suffer from the ravages of climate change in terms of losses due to floods and droughts and cyclones and storms that increase in intensity and frequency as the climate changes. But also it is the poor who need to be empowered to be able to address these issues. And sometimes perhaps the empowerment has to come through supporting them to reconstruct their ecological infrastructure. Schemes such as the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in India have been supporting small farmers to rebuild their local ecology, improve their ability to survive at times of change. Crop species which are more naturally sourced, such as land-based rice, are sometimes more likely to survive in the face of climate change than the so-called high-yielding species, which we constantly try and promote within agricultural developmental strategies. So I think we need to recognize these factors that connect biodiversity and the poor, and try and recognize the challenge of ensuring that poverty is reduced, but at the same time that biodiversity is understood better and applied better and enhanced potentially in the process of reducing biodiversity. There is no point, frankly, in having a biodiversity policy in a country which is poverty blind. Neither is there any point in having a poverty reduction strategy which is biodiversity blind, because in my opinion neither of these two approaches, which by the way are not I make a caricature, but these are not uncommon approaches to find. Very often we do find that the poor are physically excluded from forest areas which used to be their home and their lifeblood, and very often we find that almost a cavalier attitude is taken towards the loss of nature and its services when applying developmental planning. In fact, I have concerns that the lack of focus even on cities and city economies is having an impact and could have an impact in places, because there is too much of an expectation that the mining of nature, be it the mining of fish from the oceans or the mining of forests for wood and other products, or the physical mining of land which is forested for coal or minerals, is a solution. And very often I find the economics of these plans don't stack up. The kind of GDP numbers that are being chased by the countries that believe in this mining approach to development are simply not the economic numbers of performance that have been delivered in countries which are potentially much smaller and much more focused on the city as a means, as an engine of economic growth. If I contrast, for instance, Indonesia, which today targets 7% GDP growth and of course a reduction in climate change, 24 to 41%. And if I look across to Singapore, Indonesia is probably the second largest forest reserve in the world after Brazil. Singapore has almost none, and yet it has consistently achieved growth rates other than the recession of about 7%. And in fact, during the recession for 2008, its GDP growth stopped, and then it had a 14% increase the next year. So the average is still 7%. Indonesia, on the other hand, does not appear to be well advised if it's looking at a mining approach towards GDP growth, because in the process of doing so, I believe it could potentially damage the very fabric which supports its 230 million people. So we do have issues in terms of getting these messages across and recognize where poverty exists and built upon GDP growth, as sometimes as seen as the catch-all, macro indicator of progress, of success, of performance, of development, of so many things which is not really meant to be, is one of the challenges of our times, which is connected both to poverty and to biodiversity. Today, when we measure GDP growth, we are, I think, engaging in two fundamental defects. One is that we are ignoring the fact that ecosystem services are not generally accounted for in measuring GDP. And the second is that when we measure GDP and its growth, we look at averages. But the reality is that just because an average is increasing does not mean that the poorest are improving their livelihoods. The idea that the trickle-down works is something to be researched, and I would like it to be challenged, because I don't see much evidence of that in India or Peru or frankly any other country where high GDP growth rates do not necessarily automatically reduce poverty. So in measuring GDP, I believe we have potentially another challenge which connects poverty and biodiversity. And here is almost a tale of two tragedies, because on the one hand we have the tragedy of the commons, which is the ignoring of nature and therefore its lack of recognition and a lack of respect and conservation, because it is not measured, so it is not managed. And the second tragedy is actually a tyranny of the average, because in achieving GDP growth, we are ignoring the fact that just the average is increasing, but in fact its distribution may not be getting any better. I believe if we are serious about using macro statistics and we have to introduce a kind of sectoral focus. And this is why I believe that a metric such as the GDP of the poor, which had been recommended by our TEEB report last year, is worth looking at, where we look at not only just the classically measured GDP of poor sectors or poor communities or poor geographies or poor states within a country, but we look at the total income, which includes what they get free from nature. It may not be priced, but that does not mean it's not valuable. If we measure this holistic income, then we can get a sense of how much nature matters to the poor. And in TEEB, we did 3 studies for Indonesia, Brazil, and India, and we found that even though the flow of ecosystem services were relatively small, maybe 10 to 20%, as measured as a fraction of GDP, when we measured these natural flows as a fraction of the incomes of poor households, we found that they were between 45 and 90%. That's a huge difference, and I think that emphasizes the challenge, which is that we are, in our pursuit towards managing biodiversity and managing and trying to reduce poverty, we are in fact using the wrong metrics. And as I keep saying, what you do not measure, you can never hope to manage. So I end with this last thought, that in addressing these twin challenges of reducing the persistence of poverty and reducing the rate of loss of biodiversity, both of which are important and connected, I think we must not lose sight on the metrics. I hope that we will start measuring the right incomes, which is the incomes of the poor, and we hope that through these measurements and through proper policies based upon the right measurements, we will achieve both a reduction in poverty as well as an improvement in the conservation of biodiversity. Thank you very much.